Thank you, and for joining us on this Thanksgiving Eve and what I hope will be a very fun and enjoyable special show of gratitude to all of you guys ahead of this Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States, where the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel is looking to give a special bonus live stream lecture, and we will be doing that for the next hour between now and 5 o'clock p.m. Pacific time here in the United States. We will be discussing the history of Thanksgiving as well as a bunch of other important information surrounding this incredibly important holiday that is celebrated not just in the United States but has become popular throughout the entire world. So I will be bringing you history for the next hour or so as a way to give back and show gratitude this Thanksgiving. I am giving thanks for all of you wonderful friendly neighborhood historians who have liked and subscribed and who follow the channel for all of the content, long form and short form I have. Be sure to check out the long form videos I will be making about the history of Thanksgiving that will be dropping tomorrow, along with some short form content and things like that. Today is the anniversary of the first Macy's Parade, a common Thanksgiving tradition where inflatables are shipped across the streets of New York, first hosted by one of the biggest retailers in the country, Macy's, and has become one of the most important parades in American history. And that is obviously a Thanksgiving tradition, as is watching football, eating turkey, Thanksgiving leftovers, and of course lining up for Black Friday shopping hours ahead, because consumerism beats gratitude every single time, and people who are grateful are suckers. But I'm not a sucker, and I still am grateful for all of you friendly neighborhood historians who join us and enjoy the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. Oh, wow, we've got people from all over the place joining us right now. Let's see here. Interesting. So I will be talking. Hello, good to see all of you. I will be talking for the next hour about the history of Thanksgiving, why it is a controversial holiday, why a lot of people are choosing in recent days not to celebrate it at all, and what it means for us as a people and what its historical lessons are. And that is me being grateful for all of you this Thanksgiving. I am not playing basketball, so I can't hit a three. I won't be interacting with the chat so much, but it's good to see Nathaniel and Daniel and James and Smitty and everybody else who is joining us. We really appreciate it. My wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, will be moderating the chat, and you guys can have discussions. Hopefully they are history-based and all of that great stuff. He will be taking care of all of you guys. It's so good to see all of you. I really appreciate all of the support you guys have. Some of you guys have been with the channel for a long time and have shown a lot of great support. So I am grateful for you this Thanksgiving as we get ready for the holiday and as I tell you the history of Thanksgiving. So pull up a chair, turn on some background music, get yourself a cup of coffee. I've got mine with my Van Gogh Experience mug, and I'll be telling mine is pumpkin space. So I am going with that. I mean, oh, and by the way, Nathaniel, I love all of my students equally, as any teacher would tell their students. So, anyways, obviously, Thanksgiving is tomorrow. It is the fourth Thursday of November, and it has been a tradition that goes back at least 400 years in the United States. Some other countries that unofficially celebrate Thanksgiving are Indonesia, the Philippines, Germany. Obviously, there's American influences in some of these areas around the world. Canada has Thanksgiving. I forget when theirs is. It's not the fourth Thursday of November. Areas in Australia also celebrate it. Interestingly enough, Liberia celebrates Thanksgiving, and what's fascinating about that is that Liberia is one of the few African nations that was not colonized by the Europeans in the late 19th century, because Liberia was founded by former American slaves who were freed and part of the American conservation experiment in the early 19th century, were sent to Africa to create their own nation, and that became the country of Liberia, which has always had deep ties to the United States and has always been guaranteed its safety and sovereignty by the United States. So the Europeans, the British, the French, the Germans, were never able to colonize them, and they have basically held on to some American traditions. They speak English there, and of course their capital is named after an American president, Monrovia. Monrovia, Liberia is the capital, named after President James Monroe, and they celebrate Thanksgiving too there, which I think is really cool. You'll sub for Kiss. Interesting. There you go. There's your kiss. But Those are a few countries that celebrate Thanksgiving. And of course, the main celebration of Thanksgiving is in the United States on the fourth Thursday in November. And obviously, the biggest image that is ever associated with Thanksgiving is a giant Thanksgiving meal with the Pilgrims, Puritans who came to the United States in the early 1620s, along with the Native American tribe that was with them. And I don't know if anyone even knows the name of the tribe, but they are the Wampanoag people. So I will be discussing a little bit about the history and importance of the Wampanoag people, what happened to them as a result of their encounters with the European settlers, and why we should or shouldn't celebrate Thanksgiving for all of this stuff. So what's really interesting, if we look at the history of Thanksgiving, obviously the Pilgrims themselves were a group of people who had decided to leave Great Britain. They had originally lived in England for decades, and they had been part of the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestant Reformation came to England kind of haphazardly when Henry VIII decided to leave the Church of England, the Catholic Church, and establish his own church, the Church of England, in order to get a divorce. And ever since then, there have been different groups in that Protestant tradition, which became known as the Anglican Church, who have been trying to pull it towards a more Protestant or a more moderate Catholic sort of appeal. And the Puritans were the most extreme, conservative, traditional Protestants who wanted to be like the Calvinists in Switzerland under John Calvin, and other Christian groups who wanted to be more extreme in their Protestantism and wanted to get as far away from Roman Catholicism as they possibly could. And they became particularly popular throughout parts of England. They were popular with the working classes and the merchant classes. They had a lot of allies and friends in amongst the Dutch and the Netherlands, who had just been fighting for their independence from the Spanish, and Calvinism was extremely popular in the Netherlands. The French were constantly persecuting Protestants, so the Calvinists weren't as popular or well-liked in France. But the Puritans were basically a group of people who believed that not only should the church become more Calvinistic, but that it should become purer. So over the decades, throughout most of the 16th century, the Puritans grew in influence and support throughout England as they tried to purify the Church of England and fix all of the problems therein. They believed that the Church of England was too corrupt and too much like the Catholic Church for them to actually practice and worship God correctly. And with the Church of England being the only church in England, there weren't a bunch of different churches. Catholicism was considered the enemy. And obviously there were religious wars and fighting between Catholics and Protestants all throughout Europe at this point, because it's only been about 60, 70, 80 years since Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation. Basically, the Church of England wanted to hold on, with the assistance of the king and Parliament, wanted to hold on to as much control as possible over the land of England as possible. And so they really didn't tolerate any sort of deviation from the Church of England, and they saw the Puritans as a dangerous sect within the church that could cause devastation and problems. And as the Puritans continued to struggle with the mainline Anglicans and try to influence them as much as possible, a group of Puritans eventually came to realize that the Church of England had no hope. That basically the Church of England was a flawed mistake, and that this wasn't the correct Church of God that was supposed to be created, that it wasn't a real Protestant church, that it was basically just a copycat of Roman Catholicism and didn't deserve to exist anymore. And the only way to be a proper English church was to separate, so they became known as the Separatists. And since they were traveling for religious freedom and religious opportunity, they came to be known as the Pilgrims. So the Church of England, under the leadership of King James I, who, in order to standardize worship in that Anglican church, created his own Bible, the King James Bible, a translation, one of the best translations, one of the most popular and common translations of the Old and New Testament into English in the world. So because of the use of all of this, because of the use of this Bible and the standardization of worship, the Pilgrims became more and more upset with the Church of England and believed that not only were they unable to purify it like the Puritans wanted, but they needed to leave and get the heck out of England as fast as possible. King James wasn't very tolerant of them. He levied heavy taxes on them. He persecuted them. He arrested some of their preachers. And so the Pilgrims believed that they needed to go somewhere else in order to be able to worship the way they wanted and create a church in their own style and way. So they went off to where their friends were. They went off to the Netherlands, where there was strong Calvinist support and where the Pilgrims thought that they would be tolerated and treated really well. Well, they found exactly what they were looking for: a mercantile class, a very wealthy republic. The Dutch actually are the first real modern republic in the Western world. Before the United States, the Dutch had a republic in the 1600s. They found a bunch of people who believed very much theologically like they did and believed very much spiritually and biblically like they did. But they also found that they found, at least in their opinion, that the people of these lands were slackers, that they really weren't committed to real, pure Christianity the way the Pilgrims wanted it. So the Pilgrims were never happy with any Christianity any way they encountered it. And so they decided that the best thing they could do was try to go someplace else. So they returned to England, and with the permission of the king, who was happy to get rid of the Pilgrims, they made an agreement to go across the sea and form a joint stock company, which was basically a company that had the permission from the royal seal, the permission of the king, to be able to go across all over the world and spread English influence, and could basically establish whatever colony they wanted, as long as they were able to give the proceeds and the wealth that they created and the land they created to the King of England. So, promising fealty and loyalty to the king, who they despised because he had persecuted their religion, the Pilgrims decided to go west to the New World. Now, there already was an English settlement in the New World in Jamestown, Virginia, that had been established in 1607 and literally named after King James. The English had been in the New World for about 30 years by the time the Pilgrims decided to set sail in 1619 and 1620. And the agreement was that the ship they went on, called the Mayflower, there was another ship they went on as well. The name escapes me at the moment, but these two ships would bring them to Jamestown, and that they would be able to settle in part in an area of Virginia and worship God the way they wanted. They were blown off course. It was an over 90-day voyage. It was not safe and it was not pleasant, and many of them died from disease while waiting to get across the New World. While on the Mayflower, they made up an agreement of government of how they would treat each other and work, and this became known as the Mayflower Compact because it was written and signed on the Mayflower. So it was the original first. It was the first governing document ever made in the United States, at least in American history. If you consider those English colonies to be part of U.S. history, then that's the first governing document ever made in the United States, and it was made by the Pilgrims when they were aboard the Mayflower, where the bulk of them were. They eventually landed at Plymouth Rock, supposedly, in November of 1620. Many of them had died, but there were a few dozen left over, and they decided to set up a settlement there. They didn't know a lot about the region, and they didn't know what was going to happen. But naming it after a city in England is common for English explorers. So there was a city called Plymouth in England. So they had a new settlement called Plymouth in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, by the way, is the name of a native tribe that was local to the region. Many U.S. states, Mississippi, Dakota, things like that, those states are Illinois. They are named after native groups. In fact, the natives that occupied what is now New York City were called the Manhattan tribe. So Native American names for American states, cities, and municipalities are quite common, and that's no less the case with Plymouth Rock and with Massachusetts, which is obviously the state of Massachusetts. So with the establishment of Plymouth Colony, there was only a few dozen of them, and winter was setting in. Now, they found that any of their crop growing strategies that they had used in England would not work well in the New World. Most of the crops they tried to plant were not very good. The fishing was not efficient. These people knew how to fish, they knew how to farm, they knew how to build things. They just didn't know how to do it in this new land with new soil and new fishing patterns and new types of fish. So the first winter was particularly rough for them. That is true. Now, there's a lot of fact and fiction there's a lot of mythologizing that has happened to contribute to this legendary notion of the first Thanksgiving as being this time of peace and coexistence between the natives and the English settlers. And there's a lot of question marks around it. What I have told you and what I am trying to tell you in a myth-busting way is the actual story. So you have these people who settle in the land of Plymouth and have a really difficult winter, and about half of the remaining people, remember, many of them had died on board the Mayflower and the other ship, I think it was called the St. Anne, had died. So they were down to a very small amount of them, about, I think, 20 to 30 of them were left, and they had to deal with a very harsh winter, and they were worried, obviously, about the threat of natives. The local native tribe was called the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag lived in huts called niwits. They were these communal wooden buildings that were circular, domed in nature, and they would sleep on bear and deer pelts, They would wear animal skins. They were avid hunters. They were excellent fishermen, and they loved to plant. And the thing they planted most was corn. And corn has become one of the most common things to plant and harvest in the United States. And that tradition, at least in the northern part of the United States, starts with the Wampanoag people. Now, the New England area, as it became known as the colonies of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire would become known, was not known for its farming compared to the middle and southern colonies, like places like Pennsylvania or Virginia, respectively. But early on, it was known for their ability to grow corn, and they relied on the natives to do that. Now, the local native tribe, the Wampanoag, were one of several different tribes in the area, and many of these native tribes were related to each other and had some communal ties. There was also the threat of impending warfare between the different native tribes, and they didn't always see eye to eye. The Wampanoag were a threat to the safe. I think I'm freezing up here. Let's see. Okay, I think we're back. So anyways, the Massachusetts tribe was a threat, an existential threat to the Wampanoag, and the Wampanoag were an existential threat to them. Now, a common notion that has been made is that the Native Americans lived in peace and harmony throughout all of America, regardless of the diversity of the very different tribes, which I think is insulting to assume that all Native Americans are the same. The Native Americans were just as diverse as the Europeans, if not more so diverse. Especially, you have different groups settling in different areas with different traditions, languages, and customs, but even there's variation among these different tribes. Like you have the southwestern tribes, Anasazi, and Navajo, and Apache, and Hopi. And then you have New England tribes like the Wampanoag, and the Massachusetts, and the Manhattan. You have tribes in the plains like the Lakota and the Cheyenne, the Crow, and the Pawnee. And then you have tribes in the south like the Seminole and the Creek and the Cherokee. So they have some things in common, but they're actually significantly different from each other in their individual groups, let alone as opposed to different groups. There's nations like the Iroquois Nation, which were 5 native groups in upstate New York. There were 5 different distinct tribes that formed one nation. There's the Lakota Nation, which was, the Sioux Nation, which was a bunch of different tribes, more than just the Sioux. So there's a lot of different tribes with a lot of different cultural practices, and oftentimes they would be at conflict with each other. Warfare, enslavement, and other things were common among these natives, as well as trading and interaction, no different than the European groups and the Europeans that the Pilgrims had just encountered in the Netherlands and England. So, now that aside is out of the way, basically, the Wampanoag were led by a man named Massaquat. Massaquat was the leader of their tribe. I'm trying to remember his name. He was one of their other leaders, Quanum. And these 2 men were friendly to the idea of welcoming the Pilgrims. And they were especially friendly thanks to the efforts of a man from another tribe who acted as their interpreter. Now, this is the man known to legend as Squanto. Squanto was New English. Now, how did Squanto know English? Well, Portuguese, who had been sailing along with the Spanish and the English and the French for some time in the Caribbean, had encountered different native tribes. In fact, the first permanent settlement in the New World had not been built in North America, in the United States, had not been built by the English at Jamestown, but by the Spanish at St. Augustine. So for decades, the Spanish and the Portuguese and the English and the Dutch and the French had been encountering different native groups. And the Portuguese had captured Squanto and sold him as a slave. He had lived in the house of a Portuguese man, and he had learned Portuguese, as well as, like the Europeans did then and now, the languages of the other European countries. So Squanto was familiar with English and knew how to speak English. So he definitely understood the language that he was hearing from the Pilgrims, and Massaquat and Osunquam depended upon Squanto to be an interpreter to the Pilgrims. The natives were very generous and very open to the idea of these Pilgrims helping them. They needed help against the other tribes. They needed a good ally, and the Pilgrims were basically at their whim. Now, a common misconception, once again, throughout most of early American history is because the Americans, or sorry, I shouldn't say the Americans, the English, the French, the Dutch, well, the Dutch didn't really come too much, but the English and the French and the Spanish showed up with guns and weaponry. They had the advantage all the time, and the natives were at a huge disadvantage, is absolutely not true. What is true is that the natives had far more people, far more weapons, and they were usually in close range of the settlers. And because they were in close range of the settlers, arrows, throwing axes, and other weapons were almost just as effective, if not more so effective, than guns. John Smith of Jamestown, the famous captain who not only got Jamestown in shape, but is also the guy from the Pocahontas story, which is another American myth about coexistence between Native Americans and settlers, although there is truth to the story. It's just been widely exaggerated, and of course Disney got their hands on that one. He said that that natives were far more accurate with their bows and arrows than the Englishmen were with their guns. So you've got far more bowmen and you have far more accuracy. And of course you have pilgrims who don't know the land, they're not familiar with the land, and they're just kind of in the dark a little bit. Whereas the natives know the land, they know the terrain, and they know how to use it. So the pilgrims do not have a hold over the natives. The natives are completely at the beck and call, the natives have complete control and the pilgrims are at their mercy. Fortunately for the pilgrims, the Wampanoag were generous, outgoing, and also opportunistic, wanting to have yet another ally in their competition with the other native tribes in the region of that bay. So the pilgrims eventually, Squanto and Massaquat, decide to work with the pilgrims and to become allies with them. And basically, they need to know certain things. They need to know how to fish properly. They need to know what kind of food to use. They decide to start using corn. And corn becomes a popular food, like I mentioned before, for them. But it was the natives, especially Squanto, who taught the pilgrims how to farm corn properly and also how to fish properly and the different types of fishing that were allowed. I believe that salmon and trout became much more common fish, as did eels. So they ate all sorts of interesting things. So throughout most of the planting and harvest months, the natives went right by the side of the local pilgrims and helped them get the foods and different things that they needed. They taught them how to farm, they taught them how to fish, they taught them how to build structures that could withstand the snow and the elements. Of course, the Nuats, the Englishmen built similar lodges and log cabins and things like that. And so you have a development and cultivation of relationship that is only one-sided beneficial. Only the natives are giving. The pilgrims really can't teach the natives anything. Now, the idea that the pilgrims showed up just to enslave and kill natives, absolutely ridiculous. The idea that the pilgrims thought highly of the natives, also absolutely ridiculous. For them, these were half-naked people running around who were heathens who probably worshiped the devil if they didn't worship the true God. And the natives didn't know the Christian God, except Squanto, who was actually a convert to Catholicism. But a lot of the natives, as were many Indians who were taken as slaves, but many of the Native Americans did not understand the Christian religion, nor did they have any time for it. So that lack of knowledge made them heathen and heretics, and a potential field for conversion. Now, Europeans, throughout most of the medieval and early modern history, had been under one impression. You convert or you die, because if you live teaching false doctrine and heresies, you will not only send yourself to hell, but a bunch of other people. So if you refuse the true faith, be it Catholic or Protestant, which meant Catholics would be killed by Protestants and Protestants would be killed by Catholic, you were up for the chopping block and to be tortured until you confessed the true faith, then to be killed. So the idea of religious toleration and pluralism that we so easily sit on today, where we basically acknowledge the ability of people to worship any god they so please in any way, shape, or form, didn't really exist then. Now, it is true to some extent that the pilgrims had come here to escape religious persecution and worship God the way they wanted. But they hadn't come here to establish religious pluralism. The idea of religious toleration, although popularized and becoming more and more popularized during that time and afterwards, wasn't on the Pilgrims' agenda. They wanted to worship freely, but they wanted to worship freely one Christian God. One of the dissenters from the Pilgrims and Puritans who settled in Massachusetts over the next couple of decades was a man named Roger Williams, who hated the way the natives were being treated and believed that people should be allowed to worship however they choose. Because he had such disagreements with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, he went and formed his own colony, Rhode Island, and basically created baptism in America, the Baptist faith. So basically, what we have here, you have them seeing these natives who are half-dressed, who do not seem civilized in the sense they don't have large ships, they don't have guns, they don't have gunpowder, they're not conservatively dressed, and they obviously don't worship the Christian God. They are heathen. Now, they may be helpful heathen, but heathen they still are, and if they don't accept the true faith, they are the enemy. And so these people are potentially the enemy. They had a very suspicious way of looking and understanding them while benefiting from their help and assistance at the same time. However, at first, the relationship was pretty good between the natives and the settlers. The idea was that the settlers were benefiting from the natives and were showing some sort of appreciation for doing this. Now, we're getting to the meat, no pun intended, not the turkey meat, because there really might have not been turkey meat at the first Thanksgiving of the whole story. Now, the pilgrims who actually have a successful harvest thanks to the natives decide to throw a celebration that would last several days. Now, they didn't call it Thanksgiving because now you do give thanks at Thanksgiving. That's where the term comes from, and it's obviously an old Christian term that was common in Bibles like that King James Bible that I mentioned at the time. But the pilgrims wouldn't have called it Thanksgiving because Thanksgiving usually accompanied fasts for puritanical Christian groups like the Separatists. The Separatists would have understood this as a festival or a holiday, a celebration, a rejoicing of all the Lord has done for them. Of course, it was the Native Americans working to do all of this, but they actually did not initially invite them to these several days of festivities. They had a big feast. They had a bunch of basically celebrations and parties. And one of the ways they celebrated was by shooting off guns into the sky. When they shot off these guns into the sky, they got this noise alerted the Wampanoag. Now, during this time, Massaquot and the Pilgrims had agreed to a mutual defense pact where basically they would protect each other from any other natives that would endanger them, like the Massachusetts tribe that was always biting at the heels of the Wampanoag. So because of hearing the gunfire, several Wampanoag emissaries came to the Pilgrims' settlement at Plymouth and saw them having this big party. And the Pilgrims, seeing them there, decided to invite them to come in. So the idea that the Native Americans had the first Thanksgiving thrown in their honor is not true. Nor is it true that these natives showed up and were invited to it. The Pilgrims did it at a last-minute interval as a way to basically make up for egg on their face for not having done it already. What else? So obviously that's some myth busting there. Here's some more myth busting. There might have been turkey, possibly turkey, but your favorite thing, pumpkin pie, sweet potato pie, probably not. The case. What they didn't have mashed potatoes. They probably relied heavily on fishing because, once again, fishing was a reliable source of food that they could have, and it was a renewable source of food, and it would become the backbone of the New England economy and bread and food demands for the next century and a half during the colonial period. And because of that, the Native Americans wouldn't be eating mashed potatoes. They wouldn't be, maybe they would have eaten turkey or pheasant or duck. The Native Americans, particularly the Wampanoag, relied on quail, smaller birds that were more common to be eaten. And the Pilgrims would have recognized quail from the stories of the Old Testament, where Moses and the Israelites supposedly ate quail in the desert along with manna. So, anyways, the point being, let me see. So the Native Americans, what else happened? I'm lost my train of thought. Excuse me. I'm going to take a sip of coffee. If you're enjoying what you are learning about, and you're enjoying the history that I'm talking about, please be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. I don't know if Nathaniel and James and Smitty are still here, but I really appreciate seeing you guys. Don't know if they're still here or not. But anyways, back to what I was actually talking about. Yes, the lamp. It is my halo. I am a painting from the 15th century come alive to explain history to you, so this is my halo. So you see my halo just like Rihanna. So that's exactly how it is. So what was I talking about? Simon, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, what they ate at the first Thanksgiving. So some of the things. Hello, welcome. Good to see you. Some of the things they ate at the first Thanksgiving: fish, eel, pheasant, maybe quail, which was considered an accepted bird among the Wampanoag, and a cornmeal that the Wampanoag had made called numash. I believe it's called numash. And it was a common cornmeal and cornbread are sometimes common at Thanksgiving meals. But the Native Americans that was one of their main dishes and one of their favorite dishes and one of the easiest to grow. And Squanto and the other natives had taught the Pilgrims how to make this cornmeal. So cornmeal, things like that, vegetables, different gourds and roots. So you might have chumash. That's what it is, chumash. Yes. So you've got those sorts of things that were common, and those types of food were used, but it was a fish-heavy diet. It was more pescatarian than anything else, and there may not have been turkey. There was no ham, there was no sweet potato pie, and there was no mashed potatoes, unfortunately. Potatoes, actually, interestingly enough, did not become common in Europe until the 17th and 18th century, when they were imported from Central and South America by the Spanish, because potatoes grew in South America, but they were toxic in the soil they were raised from for the diets of the local natives. So when the Spanish started trading, it's called the triangular trade, resources from the New World sent back to Europe that were sent to Africa for slaves that were sent to the New World. The resources sent to Europe this was one of them, potatoes, and that's how it became common, and it grew very well in Ireland, which is why Ireland is known for potatoes, not Peru, even though Peru is where one of the places the Spanish first encountered the wonderful starch that we know as potatoes. So mashed potatoes would not have been common there. They did not grow potatoes in that area. So the festival lasted several days. It was not a one-day thing. It was not intentional for them to invite the natives. It was completely impromptu. It included shooting off guns. Very few people do this at celebrations for Thanksgiving nowadays. It was not a way to celebrate what the natives had done. It was to rejoice in the fact that they had not all died, which they should have realized lay directly at the feet of the Native Americans. So, for now, things were actually quite peaceful between the natives and the settlers. I have told you the good half of the story. I have done some of the myth busting, but obviously the question is coming up now towards, well, what about the modern story we're told where the Europeans showed up just to benefit and take advantage of the natives, enslave them, and kill them? Now, I don't think that the Pilgrims at this point had the idea in their mind that they were going to enslave and kill natives. And the Pilgrims, compared to other Europeans, particularly those in Jamestown and the Spanish, did not enslave that many Native Americans. They enslaved some. Enslavement was common in that time, especially in war. Prisoners of war often became slaves. It's a common feature in history. It had lasted for thousands of years before the Pilgrims and continues even hundreds of years after the Pilgrims. But that would eventually happen. However, at first, there was actually good relations between the natives and the Pilgrims, and the Pilgrims were helping the Wampanoag. This would all change with a man named Pequot in the 1630s. Well, not fully. I wouldn't blame the native Pequot for this. As the Pilgrims started to grow, Plymouth became a smaller colony. It was established. Everything was going fine. And then Puritans in England found out about what was going on, and under the leadership of a man named William Bradford and John Winthrop, they came to Cape Cod in 1630 and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And once again, naming a city after another city from England, they created the city of Boston in Massachusetts. So despite the fact that Plymouth had been the original colony, by the mid-1630s, it was not the biggest. 10,000 Puritans came from England to live in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which instantly became the biggest colony in New England, and obviously would eventually become the colony of Massachusetts. Basically, the natives enjoyed the natives and the Europeans enjoyed their relationship with each other. There was continual mutual support, defense, trade, and celebration. So there were other Thanksgiving celebrations, but it didn't become a formal thing until the mid-1630s. And here's the story about how that happened. As the natives and the Europeans continued to build their relationship, obviously more cultural exchange and the exchange of goods happened. And one of the big effects of these exchanges, because history is not without effects and there are always trade-offs in any encounter, the diseases of the Europeans, yellow fever, smallpox, scarlet fever, began to spread to the natives. The Europeans would die from these diseases, but they had some resistances and immunities built up to it. The natives had none. This was their first exposure. So these instantly became epidemics among the natives and led to many of them dying off. The vast majority of Native Americans who have died in the European exploration and conquest of the North and South American continents died from exposure to disease. There are very few incidents where the Europeans used the diseases as a weapon of war. They usually used gunfire and other technology as their technology de jure of war rather than biological warfare. So, what happens next? Well, more Europeans means more exposure. More Europeans means more trade. More Europeans means more anxiety because these Europeans need more and more land. And as they grow, they start to build more settlements. Salem is a great example of that, where the Salem witch trials took place. And native lands start to become more and more encroached on, as the common trend, which will last for another 2.5 centuries, unfortunately, is that the Europeans, the British, the French, the Spanish, and later the Americans, will settle in a land, grow in that land, and then move westward. And this will push and put pressure on the natives, who will never be able to quite coexist in living with those peoples because their land has been taken from them, and these lands have belonged to them for a while. Now, they may have taken that land from other native tribes, but the Europeans certainly didn't know that or care. So, anyways, basically, the 16,000. So by the 1630s, there's about 20,000, 20,000 Americans, or you could call them Proto-Americans, English colonists living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This rapid growth is a threat to the local native tribes and to one tribal leader named Pequot. So in a battle with William Bradford, the governor of Massachusetts Colony, Bay Colony, there's a small war that happens between 1635, 1636, and hundreds of natives are enslaved and killed. And in order to celebrate the victory over the natives, Bradford announces a day of Thanksgiving. This is when the first term is used. Now, once again, it's a generic Christian term from that era that is found in many of the Bibles from that era to just mean thanking God for what has happened and how they have been successful. But the first usage of the term Thanksgiving does not come from the 1620s and the Plymouth celebration with the natives in Massawat. It comes from the 1630s and the defeat of Pequot's people under William Bradford. And by this time, the Pilgrims and the Puritans have basically given up on the idea of the natives being their benefactors, and have realized that the natives, who are dealing with intertribal conflicts, intertribal politics, and warfare, enslavement, and all sorts of their own issues, as well as their own greed and avarice, these people are heathens who have rejected the Christian message and are therefore their enemies and may be a threat to them doing just what they wanted. Now, the Pilgrims had originally wanted to set up, the Puritans had originally wanted to set up a city shining on a hill. They had wanted to set up God's kingdom on the earth in this new world. Now, they were under the leadership and orders of the King of England, but in order to set up God's kingdom on the world, you have to purge it of all enemies of God. And so that was a religious justification for continuing the war and the bloodshed against the natives. So throughout the next few decades, and this is going to be the case in all the other colonies and all the other areas, for religious reasons or not for religious reasons, for petty fights and things like that, there's going to be continual breakdown of relationship between the Puritans and their descendants, who become known as the Congregationalists, and you could call them the colonists, and the native groups. And the Wampanoag tribe is going to be swallowed up, and many of them are going to die out from disease because of their high exposure to the Europeans. And many of them are also going to really, really struggle in dealing with the Europeans, who are going to become more demanding. And by the 1670s, things are getting really bad. Tensions are very high. And a man who the English call King Philip as an insult, because King Philip is usually a reference to a French or Spanish enemy, so he's an enemy, so his name is King Philip, which obviously is not his name. But he's a tribal leader. I believe he's of the Wampanoag people. This is generations after Massawat. Massawat is long dead. And his name, this guy, King Philip, basically has one of his family members killed. It's by another native from the Massachusetts tribe, and not by a European, but he assumes that it is an Englishman because a gun was used. Now, by this time, the Europeans had started to trade weaponry with the natives, and that huge advantage of more bowmen against guns is starting to depreciate, and more gunmen are showing up, and more colonists are carrying guns, and because the Indians are dying off, fewer and fewer Indians have bows and arrows or spears to protect themselves. So this leads to one of the most infamous wars, King Philip's War. It lasts for a few years, and the English are successful. Their technological advantage finally comes to full fruition during King Philip's War, and they're able to basically kick the natives out of the lands that they had held in most of Massachusetts. And so the dying off of it, Metacomet was his name. So Metacomet and his people are defeated. I believe he is killed or enslaved. And so the natives who had once been friendly, who had once relied and helped and saved the Pilgrims and the English experiment and settlement in the New World, in Plymouth, are now at the butt end of their rifles. They are their enemies and their foes. And interestingly enough, if the Pilgrims had not relied on the natives to help them through, if the first Thanksgiving, as we call it, maybe you should call it the first rejoicing, had not happened, the fact of the matter is that the Pilgrims might have very well ended up like the Roanoke tribe, lost, defeated, and annihilated. In 1586, the first English settlement in the New World was not Jamestown. Sir Walter Raleigh, who discovered a land, which is now the state, and named it after the Virgin Queen of England, Elizabeth I, naming it Virginia. After he discovered that land, he settled on an island called Roanoke. A tribe of people came with him, and they encountered natives and all sorts of things. He set them up with supplies and then departed. When he returned a few years later, he found that they were all gone. They had disappeared with only the word Croatan emblazoned on their tree. Now, several decades later, Powhatan, the chief of the Algonquin people who had made peace with the Jamestown folks, thanks to John Smith and the encounters of Pocahontas and John Rolfe and all of those people, he bragged that he had killed off the English settlers at Roanoke. But nobody exactly knows what happened. Some say they intermarried with the natives, some say the natives killed them off, some say they died from diseases, some say there's a combination of things. As a historian who knows the combination of things is an easy default, I think it was probably a combination of things. So Roanoke is the first major American mystery in history, but interestingly enough, nobody knows what happened to them. There was no records kept. They died off. There was a small number of them left to fend for themselves. They were either destroyed by the natives, intermarried with the natives, or died off on their own. Who knows what could have possibly happened there. Interestingly enough, that could have easily happened at Plymouth. No records. These people blown off course, supposed to go to Jamestown, end up in they don't know what it's called, but it ends up being called Massachusetts. They're left to fend for their own devices. When the English come back looking for them, they're gone. So the entire American experiment, which obviously is multiplied by the fact that you have Puritans coming from England and settling in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and all thanks to the good successes of the Plymouth people, which leads to the colonization of that area and the rest of the 13 colonies, you could argue that to some extent that colonization might not have happened had the Wampanoag people not helped the Pilgrims survive that first year in the New World. So history is all connected. Now, who knows what the English would have done in Virginia and the South, but New England owes its history to the Wampanoag people, at least partly. Of course, they also owe it, and I'm going to be fair here, to the bravery of the Pilgrims for their faithfulness and their desire to start a new life. So you could argue that if the Pilgrims hadn't chosen to come over here, you might not have had the settlement of New England by the English. Very fair point. So the bravery of the Pilgrims, but also the resourcefulness, generosity, and opportunism of the natives, seeing a new ally who could help them against the natives, which the Pilgrims did do throughout the 1620s. Those two things combine for an elixir that eventually becomes New England, which is and the middle colonies maybe, which is the backbone of the early American Revolutionary experiment. The American Revolutionary experiment, interestingly enough, starts in Massachusetts, and Boston is the main culprit during the 1760s and 70s. So, point being, basically the overwhelming amount of technology, weaponry, and things like that is going to push the Native Americans out of their area, and they're going to suffer great loss, and basically the relations are going to deteriorate, and the continual thoughts of the natives being savages who aren't technologically advanced, rather than wanting to learn from them, which they had originally, more and more so English settlers are going to see the natives as their enemies, and the Red Indians, as they come to be known quite scornfully, are seen as the big problem and a huge impediment to the progress of a civilization. And again, these Pilgrims wanted to establish God's kingdom here on the earth, and failure to do so would be seen as a sin. But they needed to do this, and to do this, they needed to eliminate the enemies of God, and that would include the Native Americans, unfortunately. So By the late 1600s, the Native Americans had become people to fear and hate for the descendants of those Pilgrim peoples. Now, there were always groups, like I mentioned, Roger Williams in Rhode Island, and William Penn will do it when he establishes the colony of Pennsylvania. These people will always do their absolute best to make sure that Native Americans feel treated well and incorporated, but they're going to be the minority, and their voices are going to fall on deaf ears in many ways, just like the voices of Bartolomé de las Casas and other priests, and even the Vatican, who urged the Spanish not to oppress natives in Central and South America. So, basically, the Native Americans are really going to start to suffer. They're going to lose their lands, and one tribe is going to many of the tribes will evaporate as their people just die off or are conquered by other tribes and other peoples. So the Native Americans are going to fall off. The increase of technology, mercantile establishments, and weaponry by the settlers will ensure their ability to hold on to the land. And again, many of the natives who are dying off from disease. So where does that leave us when we understand and assess the myth of the first Thanksgiving and the early relations between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims, separatists? Well, somewhere in the middle. It isn't true that the Pilgrims came here to enslave and conquer native lands and kill off as many natives as possible, especially when you understand that the vast majority of Native Americans who perish, and perishing is never a good thing, obviously, died from disease that was unintentionally given to them as a result of cultural exchange. Blaming someone for bringing disease over is not really fair when you consider that it was, for the most part, unintentional. So the Europeans did not show up, especially the colonists in Plymouth, with the intention of trying to kill off as many Native Americans as possible. That's simply historically ignorant. But it is historically relevant to say that they did show up and they saw these peoples who they believed to be heathens and inferior, and who to some extent technologically were inferior to the Europeans, but were also far more adept at knowing the land, far more adept at farming the land, and could be powerful allies. Now, it is also a myth to say that the natives were just constantly trampled underfoot by the Europeans and that the settlers started treating them like crap instantly. Not true either. The natives, for their part, had the advantage. They had more people, they had more weapons, and they had an understanding of the land. Their knowledge was their biggest asset, and as they shared that knowledge, things started to balance out, and as more Europeans came, they eventually started to get the advantage. But basically, the idea that, they didn't just come to take land, to steal land, and to kill people. They didn't know what they were going to encounter. And again, they were blown off course. They could have easily ended up like Roanoke. Nobody knew what a Plymouth was, what Massachusetts was. They ended up there, it was some years, the Dutch had ended up in New York, by the way, by this, I think it was a few years, it was at that point the Dutch were in New York, but there weren't English settlements in this area. The English were all in Virginia. So accidentally showing up in Massachusetts and encountering the natives there and wanting to trade with them and needing to survive and learning from them, and yes, exposing them to diseases is not the elixir or the ingredients you need for an actual genocide of an entire people group. More likely than not, it is a circumstantial arrangement where you have a group of people who have particularly strident religious beliefs that obviously have been questioned and persecuted strongly, who want to implement those religious preconceptions on everyone around them and hold them to standards that those people don't even know about. So that is obviously going to be a recipe for disaster, because you have the natives either not willing to embrace Christianity or not understanding what Christianity is, and these people basically saying Christianity or death. So, which is how they were raised and what they had encountered, and they had just been persecuted for not being the right type of Christian, let alone, obviously encountering someone who was not Christian. So there's a lot of traditions and problems that the natives that the Pilgrims bring with them to the New World, and there is a level of mutual beneficence and help at first that it shouldn't be undermined. We shouldn't pretend that the Native Americans and the settlers did not get along at all, and the settlers were only out to take advantage, and the natives were these peaceful people who never wanted to do anything or use the settlers for any of their advantages. They needed the settlers to help them fight wars against other natives, and they needed allies, and they needed strong allies. It was not a one-way defense pact that had Massawat send his emissaries to that first Thanksgiving feast, or rejoicing feast, if you want to call it that now. It was The Mutual Defense Pact, meaning that the Pilgrims were responsible for defending the natives just as much as they were responsible for defending the Pilgrims. From who? Other Europeans? No, from other native tribes, which undermines the entire issue, because the entire issue is the assumption that the Native Americans have generally been the peaceful ones, and the Pilgrims and the settlers were generally aggressive and warlike. This is all circumstantial. It all is on a case-by-case basis. There were many native tribes that were peaceful, and there were many who were not. And the Wampanoag were peaceful towards the settlers, but not always peaceful toward other native groups. So, basically, the point being, you have an overwhelming amount of conflict between the natives and the settlers, but that develops over time. It doesn't start right away. It is not acceptable what happened. The point I am trying to make is, what I was going to say next is basically, as time goes on, you have a breakdown in communication, you have a breakdown of these relationships, and that is going to lead to the conflict and fighting between the natives and the settlers that is far more unsavory and full of racist epitaphs and hatred that didn't exist the first couple of years. And that came through greed and avarice, but it came through political disagreements, tensions, and fighting amongst native groups, amongst each other, as well as between the natives and the settlers. So those are some things to understand about that part of the story. Now, what about the Thanksgiving meal itself? Obviously, there was a meal that was shared between the Pilgrims and the natives. The first big myth. It was unintentional. They did not intend to invite the Native Americans to come to this celebration. The celebration was originally just intended to be the settlers rejoicing, not giving thanks, because that included fasting for the fact that they had survived an entire year in this land. Now, they had the Wampanoag to thank for that, but the Wampanoag were not aware of these celebrations until that Mutual Defense Pact and the emissaries were sent by Massasoit. These people would enjoy the Thanksgiving celebrations as they were in an impromptu way, invited into doing this. So, the problem is that you don't have exactly the feast and the meal that we think of. So most of the food that we eat at Thanksgiving, or about half of it, was probably not there the original time. It lasted several days. There were firings going off. That's how the natives got there in the first place. And the natives weren't even invited necessarily. So you have an impromptu invitation replacing the idea of a mutual feast. You have the natives bringing their different types of food. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I apologize. Chumesh. So them bringing chumesh. They had lobster. They had eel. They had fish. And that is stuff you will not be eating tomorrow, probably not. Now, if you want to have an authentic original Thanksgiving, you're going to have lobster, eel, different, maybe salmon, and chumesh, which could be, you could make a porridge or a cornmeal or a polenta. That's something like that, I guess. But most of those dishes we don't necessarily have at the Thanksgiving table. Now, they did have squash, they did have green beans and things like this, but the meal would have looked a lot different, and it lasted several days. That probably included the singing of many psalms and hymns, prayers. I don't know if anyone still says grace when they do a Thanksgiving meal. I'm not saying anyone has to, but obviously different types of prayers and Christian celebrations were common at this feast because it was a Christian feast. So that's true. So there is truth that there was a celebration between the natives and the Pilgrims, but if you go to that surface level of an explanation, you won't understand that there's a lot of myth that's associated with what was eaten, the relationship between the natives and the Pilgrims, and how things went afterwards. So obviously, a huge indictment upon Thanksgiving, looking at its legacy, the legacy of Thanksgiving, is that it is a holiday steeped in violence and genocide. Now, I would view this as a historian to be false, at least on the surface. It is true that killing, warfare, and depopulation and dispossessing came, but that wasn't any on the minds of the Pilgrims at the first Thanksgiving feast with the natives. That wasn't a fear of Massasoit. That wasn't a fear of Squantos. These people had worked together in order to survive, and the natives felt they could use the Pilgrims, and maybe the Pilgrims felt they could use the natives. The idea of enslaving and killing off hundreds of natives doesn't come until, like I said, Pequot's War in the 1630s. For the first couple of decades, things are extremely peaceful between the two groups, so you can't just say that Thanksgiving is a holiday designed to celebrate genocide and the killing of Native Americans. That doesn't make any sense. That's anachronistic. That's like me saying Christmas is a holiday to celebrate Santa Claus when its original intention was to celebrate the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. So, I mean, yes, we have Santa Claus, we have these traditions. The history and the traditions are important. So the history of what happened to the Native Americans and their interactions with the Europeans, especially important. November is Native American Appreciation Month for a reason, and it should remain that way. And it is interesting that it is in November when people are quick to discard that in order to celebrate Turkey Day and not realize that there was devastation done to the Native Americans. We also have to acknowledge that that devastation doesn't just come from the hands of the English or the Americans. That devastation comes from the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, any basic European group that encountered them, as well as from other native tribes who were always threatening and destroying and enslaving each other. And if you were a peaceful Native American tribe, like the stereotype of the what is called peaceful savage, you were probably at the behest, a vassal, or quick to be enslaved by another more warlike, aggressive native tribe. Great example of this is what the Apaches did to the Navajo and the Hopi, who were a pacifist tribe in the Southwest in California. So so the Pilgrims did come to eventually view the natives as slaves and people to be enslaved, and there was a lot of enslavement that happened later on, but that was not the original case. I am looking and speaking specifically about the first couple of years of their arrangement. The growing consensus later on is that the natives, who are heathen, who are the enemy, need to be properly civilized, and that could include destroying their villages and enslaving them. And obviously all sorts of other horrible atrocities that I can't mention on YouTube for fear of problems happen to natives, and I understand that completely. I am not downplaying that. I know some of the people in the chat are saying that I am. I am not ignoring that. I am saying that it is not relevant to the. I'm not saying that it is directly relevant to the story of Thanksgiving itself. To say it is an anachronistic application to what happened during Thanksgiving that the Native Americans. That we say that the holiday is full of genocidal intentions. I don't even believe fully that the term genocide is fair to apply to the warfare between the Native Americans and the different Europeans in North and South America. And I understand why people use that term. I understand the devastation. I am not making any excuses for it. What happened was awful, but I don't think that Thanksgiving is responsible for it, nor the celebration of that day. Now, where do Native Americans, interestingly enough, many Native Americans celebrate Thanksgiving as a way to give themselves hope and to give thanks. Some do not celebrate it at all, and some protest it actively. There is a split consensus among the Native Americans about what to do. And when a split consensus is no consensus at all, there is a split among Native Americans about how to celebrate and understand Thanksgiving. A native tribe in the Southwest or in the Northwest has nothing, the Nez Perce or the Navajo, for example, have nothing to do with what happened at the first Thanksgiving. So, obviously, those experiences, which were often brutal and terrible, that the natives had to go through at the hands of the Europeans, which show that the Europeans were the ones who weren't very civilized in many cases, despite their demands and ideas that they were, and of course that applies to the United States and the Americans later on, are irrespective of what happened between Massasoit's people and the Pilgrims. What happened later, obviously not excusable. So there is some myth busting to be done on both sides. The idea of a peaceful, tranquil existence where people were living in peaceful harmony and the Pilgrims were these upstanding, wonderful people in all ways and all forms, devastatingly untrue. But to say that it was just an opportunistic way to use and manipulate people by only one side, and that murder and mayhem were on the minds from the beginning, also untrue. There is a moderate position about Thanksgiving that I think is a very fair one to take, and hopefully, based on some of the information I've shared, you may share it as well. You may share this idea as well. You have the arrival of a group of people who are blown off course, who have no idea where they're going. They see a group of natives. They have their own religious predilections and biases against this group of natives. However, they also have a desire to survive, and they come to rely on those natives in order to do it. And at the very end, impromptu or otherwise, they eventually share a feast and some sort of communal bonding with these native groups. And there is this desire that they will take care of the natives and the natives will take care of them. And that it doesn't have all the same food, it doesn't have all the same traditions and customs. Things change in 400 years between the natives and the pilgrims that we have at our Thanksgiving tables. But and the idea that it was just this intentional thing that they've been planning for months is not true. It lasted for several days rather than a day. So I've done a lot of myth busting there. But there is some level of a potential ideal, at least, of outward, at least ostensible, cooperation between natives and whites that was abandoned later on in many different ways for many different reasons. And you can't say that that mass genocide or any of those things were really on the mind of people when they're sitting down to eat together. Now, there may have been suspicions, distrust, and worry, and obviously you're dealing with people who they consider to be heathens. They're fleeing their own religious persecution to bring religious persecution to this land, which is interesting enough. The Pilgrims did plenty of awful stuff. Obviously, enslavement of other peoples was common in the Europeans. The Europeans are enslaving Africans at the same time in mass numbers, and the English will be doing that. 1620 and 21 come right after 1619, when the first first black slaves arrive in the New World in Jamestown. So that's a point of order. But but there isn't that happening here. You have some sort of cooperation, some sort of coexistence, and some sort of peace, and perhaps an ideal that has been lost because people have given way too much into the legends to actually work on achieving that ideal of living together in some sort of communal bond and understanding one another, where one another is coming from, not seeing one as the enemy, but seeing one to be used, but seeing each other as people to be respected and treated well, and yes, to give thanks for. And I didn't expect to end it on that point, but I think that's a great place to end it. One more quick epilogue and appendix to this is obviously the first Thanksgiving is declared it's celebrated on and off for the next 2.5 centuries, and then in the midst of a civil war, in order to unify a nation and to show gratitude to the Almighty, who he believed was helping pull the nation through the war and its own division, Abraham Lincoln obviously makes Thanksgiving a national holiday, and he pardons the first Thanksgiving turkey, naming it Jack. This is in 1863. Now, Lincoln doing this may sound pretty irrelevant based on everything I've just told you, but think about when Lincoln did this, the heart of the Civil War, right after the Gettysburg Address, by the way, which is the greatest speech in American history probably, and only lasted 2 minutes. Lincoln gives this speech right after commemorating a battlefield where tens of thousands of men have lost their lives. I think Lincoln saw Thanksgiving as a way to bring together people who had different perspectives and different backgrounds and try to unify a country, because the Thanksgiving story in both legend and I think in actuality to some extent are stories of community and bonding together. And I think Lincoln saw the need to do that as a nation. He saw the need to tap into the national identity, whether you were a Northerner or a Southerner, a black slave or a free man in the South or wherever, whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, which still applies today. He saw the need to unify the country and create a sense of community, national identity, culture, Americana, and what better example than the holiday or the celebration of rejoicing, or Thanksgiving, first celebrated by the Pilgrims with the Wampanoag people in 1621. So I think that in truth, Abraham Lincoln saw the hope that this holiday offered and the ideal that this holiday offers so many people who need it, especially in a time of great division and strife, the worst in American history. And I think Lincoln maximized that and added that to America's cultural identity as a way to try to bring unity when things were far worse for Americans than they had ever been before. So that is a little bit. So I think Lincoln, perhaps, despite him not being perfect either, and obviously having a very skewed perspective about Native Americans in his own right, I think Lincoln's model and his work is actually a very touching and interesting and inspiring way to view the holiday. And this holiday, I am grateful that Abraham Lincoln made Thanksgiving a national holiday and put it on the map to unite Americans and make them realize that there is more that binds us together than divides us. And I think the Pilgrims on that over those few Thanksgiving days with the Indians would have agreed, and so would have the Native Americans. And by the way, I use Indians and Native Americans interchangeably because I used to believe that Indians is an insult. I think somebody in the chat called it a slur. Indian is not based on Columbus's misconception that he had reached India. Yes, he had the misconception. Yes, Amerigo Vespucci corrected him, which is why it's called America. Oh, by the way, one quick aside. Ben Franklin wanted to rename America Columbia after Columbus, and he wanted to name the national bird the turkey, which is interesting. So Lincoln pardoning the turkey. Franklin wanted to be the turkey. The other founders voted him down because they didn't think the turkey was majestic enough, so of course they picked the bald eagle. Just a quick aside. So the turkey has had some significant parts in American history. Ben Franklin wanted it to be the national bird, and then Lincoln pardons the first one, Jack, when he makes Thanksgiving a national holiday, and the president always pardons a turkey, as you guys know. So basically, that is a quick history about Thanksgiving and the celebration, which may or may not have included turkey. Turkey came from South America, but they had turkeys in North America. They had turkeys in Canada and North America at that time. But yes, so for me, this is a holiday of giving thanks, of appreciating the things in my life that I'm grateful for, and looking forward to the things that in the next year that's coming up quickly that I can be grateful for, and I hope it's that way for you as well. So I'm going to. I really enjoyed. I've seen some blowback, but I've also seen a lot of support in the chat, and I really appreciate it. And everything. I'm going to go through the chat really fast, just give you guys a couple of minutes, show my gratitude to you by reading some of your comments here. I'm not doing any tricks. But yes, Simon is right. My wonderful moderator, Simon, has been holding down the fort. If you enjoyed what you learned about, if you enjoyed the history of Thanksgiving and everything going on there, and you enjoyed its message and me doing some myth busting about it, I think I did like at least 10 things that are myths about Thanksgiving. Maybe I can make a video about that. Be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Check out the long form, short form content. Look forward to my video tomorrow about the history of Thanksgiving, where I'll talk a little bit more about this. Oh, the Kleenex box, that's not product placement. I wish that they supported me, but they did not. Thank you, Logan. I really appreciate that. I do not wear a cowboy hat. Do not wear a cowboy hat, but if Dustin does, he does. Thank you for checking grammar. Where would we be without? Yeah, the video Game Boy. I saw you in the chat. You did not like what I was saying. You're not going to learn much from this guy. Well, unfortunately, I mean, if you already know everything about history, then there you go. But as Socrates said, I have learned one thing above all, and that is that I know nothing. So please, tell me where I'm wrong if you're still here. Yeah. I appreciate critique and criticism. I appreciate people trying to learn and join us. And Nathaniel, if you're still here, by the way, I really appreciated you coming. It was great to see you again. Columbus Journal started this. He saw them as prime slaves. Yes, Columbus said that. Columbus said a bunch of different things. And yes, he thought there was an opportunity to take them and turn them into slaves. He was not the main enslaver of the natives. I did not mention Christopher Columbus until I talked about Columbia. I did not use his name in this live stream. This live stream is about Plymouth Colony and the founding of New England, not about Columbus. And yes, Columbus did enslave natives. And yes, Columbus saw them as prime targets for enslavement, probably because he saw them as uncivilized. But he also saw them as a people to be engaged with, to trade with. He liked the Taino tribe that he encountered, and the Tainos warned him about a tribe called the Carib tribe, which he got the term Caribbean. The Carib tribe was constantly acquiring Tainos and murdering them and eating them. And that's where the term cannibal comes from. I don't know if you know that, Video Game Boy. I don't know. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I'm sure you seem to know a lot. You definitely know about Columbus. I'm sharing the other side of it. I'm sharing both sides as fairly as I can. Yes, I agree, Janet. I hate this retroactive, you have to think the way I do, or else you're ignorant. Because in 100 years, people are going to think different than you do, and you're going to be the ignorant one. And I want people not to think of me as racist and backwards in 100 years. I want them to think of me as what's called a victim of my time. And I think that that's a historically fair thing to do. Yes, there's constant killing of natives in different areas. And the natives, I wouldn't say the natives should appreciate us. Do you mean like white people, like Americans? I wouldn't say that, especially when you consider the mass degradation, loss of land, dignity, and life the natives suffered at the hands of the Europeans, who had the technology and wherewithal to make it as systematic a dispossession of land as possible. I would never say that. And obviously, disease, intentional or not intentional, is a horrible thing to deal with, so I wouldn't go that far. Columbus's journal would not disagree with my assessment. I don't believe that's true. I think that Columbus had his assessment. I don't think that's the only assessment. I think that's Howard Zinn's assessment, and that's the thing Howard Zinn chose to focus on. But I'm going to focus on more than just that. And I didn't mention Columbus. Columbus lived 130 years before the Pilgrims. Columbus was dead 120 years before the Pilgrims. Columbus never landed in North or South America until his final voyage. His first encounter with the natives that you're referring to was with the Taino and Carib tribes in the Bahamas, and then he later went to Cuba. So, anyways, I don't know why it's the last Thursday. I think it's because that's the closest. It was a year anniversary of when they arrived, the Pilgrims, and it's a year, so they celebrate it, and they're trying to hit as close to a year since they arrived, because they arrived in late November of 1620. So around a year later, they had the 3 to 4 day celebration, and because of that, it's an elusive date, so we always pick, I don't know why it's a Thursday. I don't know why. That'd be an interesting thing to look up for. So, yeah. This kid definitely calls his parents mother and father. Yeah, mom and dad's better for me, but thank you. Video Game Boy, I hope you're here. Charger, the phone died. I was going through the chat, answering everything, but yeah. If anyone still here? Simon, can you hear me? I am technically back on there. I see a few people are here still. I'm sorry for the disconnection. I was having such a lovely time. But let's see. Yes, we are back. I will go for a couple more minutes reading some chats and comments. But if you enjoyed this, if you really like learning about the Thanksgiving story and you want to learn more history from me, like and subscribe. Join us for our live streams on Fridays at 8 p.m. I will be joining you on Black Friday. So after you do your shopping, come and join the Friendly Neighborhood Historian. Ask me. There I will be answering questions. I will actually be going through the chat, answering every single question I can, and doing all of that great stuff. Justin, you brought up an interesting point earlier. It's good to see you, by the way. I didn't get to answer it, and I wondered what it was. It was something about the natives. And I thought that was a very good point of order. So if you enjoyed what you have learned, like, subscribe, join me Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern for some more Q&A, then Saturday at 7 p.m. Q&A, and then Sunday I will be doing another live stream lecture. I might take a break. I don't know. I might want to take a break after doing 2 this week, but we'll see. I'm not sure. About everything... the talk about Thanksgiving. We had a really good chat there, and I hope you guys can still hear me and everything, and it was really, really appreciated all the great talk in the chat and all of the support, and I appreciate Simon for moderating. I'm very grateful for you, Simon, and I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I will see you guys Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern for our weekend Q&A back-to-back, so hopefully you guys will really enjoy that. But thank you. I hope you enjoyed learning about Thanksgiving from me. Take care. This is the Friendly Neighborhood Historian saying have a great Thanksgiving. Happy Turkey Day. Bye-bye.